Welcome, Tania. I'm really delighted that you can join me on our next interview in the series on leading through the pandemic, which I started as we started to see some of the both the trauma and some of the amazing innovations the NHS was suddenly able to put in place. And I think you and I talked briefly last week about at moments we saw the NHS turning into a high-performing health system, and out of sort of nowhere, things that were impossible became possible. Whether it was from enabling people to do the discharge to assess together that they'd never been able to do before, or people to feel that they were properly part of teams. There was a lovely story from one of the doctors that responded to our survey that we did that said, I've worked in the NHS 10 years and I've never felt part of a team. I've never had 24/7 food and drink. And actually, I felt like I was a safari doctor. I was never part of a team. And it's so lovely to be part of a team. So what I wanted to do today with you was just to set a little bit about setting the scene, which is with this survey that we found these 10 leaps forward. And the 10 leaps forward were these. So there was a sort of baseline, this is what we have sorted out. One was about staff being properly valued, which was the food and drink issues. The 21st century tools, and my worry is the NHS will only focus on all the digi stuff, not about this phenomenal cultural change. But here were the really important things, these visible and connected and engaged leaders, and the basics sorted. And the basics might be contractual or getting a printer, whatever, all of those things. And then the next thing we saw was this joined up care, people being able to collaboratively work together. And this one that I really want to talk to you about in a minute, about staff working brilliantly together as teams. Staff being able to step up and take professional responsibility. I talked briefly to Brent James about that a couple of weeks ago. And these two, I think, are really interlinked. And then the last ones that were needs-based decisions and working very differently with citizens. But it's this one around teams and around professional autonomy and decision-making that I really wanted to talk to you. And the reason why I invited you, Tania, was because of your amazing experience with Buurtzorg as a coach and being able to really understand that in both how that works in the Netherlands, really supporting people to be the very best they can be, to make fantastic decisions as peers, to be professionally responsible, to use data to inform their decision making, and how that translates into the most hierarchical Western democracy. How on earth do we do it in an NHS that is so wedded to a hierarchical model and a feudal model in our democracy too? So that was why I invited you, Tania, here. And it would just be absolutely lovely if you could perhaps just say a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm struck that I've got as mad a hairdo on that photo as I do on the screen here today. And that was pre-lockdown, so I got to do something about that. But thanks, Becky, thanks for inviting me. So, as you said, I've been working with Buurtzorg in the Netherlands in here for the past 3 or 4 years. And it started really when I was OD lead in Tower Hamlets. And as part of my role there, it was really working with the Tower Hamlets Together partnership, which was a really visionary partnership, still exists, looking at how health and social care and voluntary sector and the community can come together to work better together in service of the patients and families of the community. And Buurtzorg was one of our projects. So we set up a pilot, we like to call them pioneers, a pioneer team, a community nursing pioneer team to explore and kind of prototype the Buurtzorg ways of working in the UK. And then since then, I've worked with other health and social care teams and mixed teams, kind of really exploring how does it work, how can it translate, how do we do this in the context that the UK, as you have just said, presents itself. But I guess, I'm not just an OD practitioner and coach, so I wear many hats, and I think, as I said to you the other day, I was a clinician, a GP originally, already working in fairly innovative ways, looking at how do we really create a healthy community? How can we work with our patients as partners and come out of this kind of model where we're seen as experts? And I suppose that's in a way the golden thread throughout my work is how can we work more collaboratively? How can we work with in order to create better health for all of us? unfortunately, I've also had my own health issues, so I've been in that role as patient. And as many people know, I also have a mother who is in her 80s with dementia, who I hope isn't going to phone us whilst we're doing this. And she's, yeah, well, that's right. And she's living at home with care support. So I guess I come with multiple lenses, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the one of the lovely things about how we're all operating these days is, you know, I welcome you to my home, you welcome me to your home. We're whole people with whole lives, and actually, I think one of the starting points, and maybe this is where we start around what makes great teams work, is how do you bring yourself to work, and how do you bring the valuable self you are. And I was talking to somebody who was saying, I've stopped calling myself a nurse, just a nurse. I'm a nurse. And these very small nuances have been so significantly important. So what I've seen, I suppose, is that particularly in primary care and to some degree in hospitals, I've seen people really think about check-ins, really think about how we check out each other, think about headspace for learning, create spaces for you to bring your whole self to work, for you to say how you are. That real sense that everybody in the team matters. And so I'd really love to talk to you, Tania, about, so what is it in the sort of founding culture of Buurtzorg that means they were able to generate and support these fabulous self-managing teams in a way that enabled them to be the best they could be?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm sure that as Buurtzorg has evolved, so the philosophy has evolved, if you like. But I think what they did is they started off with some very basic premises. And the mandate really that Jos de Blok, the founder, gave to the teams when he first set it up in 2007 were kind of three things. I really want you as a professional nurse to go forth and provide the best quality care that you possibly can in service of the needs of the patient and their family in the community. So that was one of the kind of the mandates, if you like. The second was and in order to do that, I will support you and create a great environment in which and from which for you to work. So that notion of kind of great teams, have fun at work, be happy at work, that all kind of comes into that ethos, if you like. And the third one was this has got to work as a financial model, as a business model. And so we got to make sure that the checks and balances work. So part of your mandate and responsibility is also to make sure that this works financially. And in essence, Becky, those are the three things that kind of the framework, if you like, upon which Buurtzorg is based. So those are the three kind of principles, if you want to call them that. But I guess it sits upon a kind of a care model which looks a bit like an onion. So if you cut an onion in half and you get the concentric circles, and the kind of the innermost circle is the patient, the client. I use the words coterminously. And really everything that is done within Buurtzorg is looking into that space and comes from that space. So it's referred to as the inside out model. Everything starts in that core. And coming from that patient, then we start to think in the next circle about, well, what are the informal networks around that patient? What are the other people, who are the other people who might live with that person in their home next door, the neighbors, the family, the extended network, the hairdresser. My mum's hairdresser is the first one who will call me up and say, your mum didn't come for her appointment today. So it's all those other people that hold people in their communities and raw value. And around them, then we have the teams, and we'll come on to talk a bit more about them. And then beyond the teams, the self-managing teams who wrap around that whole community setup are then the kind of the more formal organizational structures, the GP, the pharmacy, all the other experts and expertises that we have to draw on to look after people.
And what's lovely just hearing of that is that, of course, what we've seen in the pandemic in some of the great innovations in primary care have been where GPs are talking about, well, now I'm zooming in or e-consulting in, I'm able to see the person's context. I can talk to their family. Now that people are sheltered, they're reaching out, and I'm having to reach out to people, and lovely thoughts about, well, with our kids that are homeschooling or not getting anything the school's got a relationship with those kids, the GPs have got, why aren't we doing that together? So actually the pandemic has helped us, particularly I think in primary care, really start with need. And it's lovely to hear that's the foundation. But that is quite a flip because we're so used to demand-led services.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we're starting to see in your report, isn't it? That the system has become much more need-based and needs-led, and really thinking about how do we look after the needs of our patients and our communities at the moment in the time of COVID, that is absolutely central to that Buurtzorg ethos.
And then, so then when we're thinking about teams, I suppose I go back to my clinical days, which are now 30 years ago, where we were working as, I think, fairly autonomous teams, and that has become just devastated, actually, incrementally devastated. And yet it's so important and so wonderful that Buurtzorg really understands the power of devolved decision-making, peer-led and peer review. How one of the people's fears, I suppose one of the fears in a mechanistic system is, are folk competent to make decisions together? What if they go wrong? What's the risk?
Yeah.
So how do you ensure that you get the very best out of people in that Buurtzorg model, Tania?
And I think a lot of it comes back down to trust, but it's not just trust. I know that's a word you're not so keen on, but I think it's, people have come through professional training. People have got experience, both in work and in their own home life. Whilst they may never have set up a financial budget sheet in the work context, they probably manage all their finances back at home. So it's what you were saying before, Becky. It's really about bringing that whole of you to work and not just seeing you in necessarily that professional context. So really working with people's tacit experience in the professional environment and saying, we know you can do this. So let's stand back and let you go forth with the needs of the patient at the forefront. So in Buurtzorg, they have small teams of 8 to 12 people with a coherent skill mix, often quite kind of more well-trained staff, if you like, than lesser trained staff. So kind of front-loaded in terms of experience and expertise and knowledge and understanding. To really work together and say, here are the patients that we need to look after. They are our patients. There's a collective responsibility within the teams to really provide the best care. And they have the data that helps to provide that. They have IT systems that help to support the knowledge and the material that they need in order to provide that care. And you know what? Over the past 10, 13 years that Buurtzorg was running, they started with one team. They now have 10,000 members of staff, 950 teams. The complaints have absolutely shot down. Feedback and client experience has gone incrementally up. So there's something that they're doing in terms of really allowing nurses to be nurses and carers to be carers and saying, we know you know what to do. Professionals set out to be, nurses set out to be nurses, to be the best nurse and to provide the best care. And I think what Buurtzorg have done by kind of taking the bureaucracy out and stripping back some of those layers and allowing nurses to do the caring and have the time to care is that people come forth. And that's what we've seen through this pandemic. No one's had extra training. People have done what they need to do in order to care for their patients. And when they haven't known or haven't had the skills, then they go and ask and they go and find out.
And that's been, I think, one of the lovely about stories you hear. People say, well, I'm back in the learning community. I'm ringing up people that I didn't know. I'm finding out. I'm ringing up other specialists. We're meeting at the bedside. We're meeting on the e-consult. GPs reaching into secondary care now saying, can we have these outpatient appointments together? I mean, that's just completely fabulous.
Yeah.
But what I think I hear as an underpinning, which is that people step up and take full professional responsibility. Yeah. Secondly, that they have the data on which to do that. So Tania, would you tell us a little bit more about, so what's the data these folks have? What
Yeah,
all about?
absolutely. Yeah. So one of the wonderful things, and when I went out to Holland and met with some of the Buurtzorg nurses, they all very proudly open up their iPad. So they all have access to a piece of equipment that gives them live information that they are able to use to be autonomous. You know, people need data. Data is power. So so on their iPads, they are fully set up and equipped, bespoke for them as nurses doing their work. So there's a whole portfolio around clients. So all their client notes, their client care, their client visits are all documented there. They have a library of resources. So the equivalent of the BNF, the National Formulary, the prescribing guidelines, the NICE guidelines, the protocols and procedures would all also be there at a click of a button. So if in the moment they were a bit rusty, you know, weren't quite sure, they would have access to that knowledge on their laptops. And the third really important element is around, third or second? Second, I think we're on, is around their team working. So all the information that they need around how they're performing as a team, what their productivity is like, and I can say a little bit more about that, how many patients they've got on their workload, who's doing what on that day. So everything to do with their teamwork and the responsibility that they need to take for organising themselves as a team is available to them, again, on their iPads, including team meeting notes, etc. And the third element that exists then is the whole notion of that network and how you build that network. So they've got access to pharmacies in the area, the local imams, the local churches, the local, you know, all those other elements that are important are there. And not least their own network, their own professional network. So in the moment where they don't know, and you were just talking about, you know, you're seeing people reaching out, they can reach out to the 959,000 other nurses that they've got working for Buurtzorg and say, hey, I've got this, you know, I've got a patient, I've never come across this condition before, or I don't know what to do, can you help? So they've got their own networks of kind of expertise and people and champions to draw on to say, I don't know, and that's fine, it's a learning environment. And last but not least, they've got, as part of that network, they've got what's called the kind of the back office, the support functions that really enable those teams, those self-managing teams, to become and be self-managing. So all the things, HR, my laptop doesn't work, rather than spending 3 hours on an interminable call trying to get through to IT to tell them that it doesn't work, you know, there's someone they can say, my iPad's not working today, and someone will take that off their hands and get it sorted. So everybody's really working in a culture of support and serve to really enable those nurses to do the jobs that they're there to do.
So let's just think about when things go well and when things go less well. So let's say you've got a colleague and you're slightly worried about their decision making, and you're slightly worried about their pace because we're trying to perform as a whole team. And let's say we've got someone that's, you know, taking their time and we've got all these to do. That means that my workload is looking higher because you're not pulling your weight. How do those things get resolved, Tania?
Yeah. And I think they're always really difficult issues, aren't they? Because on one hand, I think we need to be mindful that we are all different.
Yeah.
You know, and that of course, as part of a rich and high value team, you want difference. You need to encourage difference because you need that complementarity of skills and experience and ideas to get something richer and better. So you've got that balance with the kind of how do we all perform well enough according to our capabilities. And teams have to have those open conversations, Becky. You know, there are, I think I said, you know, Buurtzorg asks for one of the performance standards, if you like, and it's actually the only one really, is a 60 or 61% productivity rate. And so what they look at and what they measure is how much of your time is what's called kind of face-to-face client time. But within that is included all your GP calls, the calls to order the bed, the pharmacy, all those other additional, it's not just your literal face-to-face time. That's all included in that. So 40% of a nurse's time or a carer's time includes travel time, study time, a few days for the occasional cold, annual leave, training, and team meetings. So protected time for team meetings. So teams are autonomous and need to take responsibility, and they have to, like many teams, have some difficult conversations. When it's really not working so well, and I'm seeing 6 people and you're only seeing 2 because actually you stopped off for a coffee somewhere. You and I, we need to have a conversation around that, and we need to have that conversation as a team about how do we expect and what can we expect from each other, and how do we share the workload. And when it really goes wrong, or a solution, an effective solution can't be reached, then they have coaches at hand that they can call upon to support the working of the team.
So one of the things that obviously most people think when they think of a team, they think of a team that has a person at the top and a few people in the middle and a few people at the bottom, and the person at the top divvies out the work to the rest.
Yes.
Team meetings are led by the person at the top. And you're describing something a bit different from that.
Totally different. So I'm describing a team where people might have different bandings and might be paid differently, but as a team, they're a bit like the 3 Musketeers. It's one for all and all for one. They're there as a collective, and they're there to serve the needs of their patient group as a collective. So that doesn't mean that they all do the same thing. So in Buurtzorg, they have distinct roles that they take on within the team, in addition to their primary caring role. And those get rotated around the team. The team can decide how often they're rotated. But I guess the purpose of rotating is skill development, skill mix. It means that everybody has a bit of an understanding of what that role involves. And of course, with certain roles, there's a certain amount of power that can go with them. So the person who's responsible for doing the rostering, can be seen to potentially be yielding some power. So by rotating it, you kind of eliminate that sense of hierarchy that can creep in if you're not careful into a team.
So the team's going quite well. They're quite enjoying, they're doing their 60%, 40%.
Yeah.
Maybe some of their outcomes aren't quite so good. So what point does that get flagged up? And then how does Buurtzorg as a corporate intervene in teams?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, what happens when you stand back, and I think what your paper demonstrates is that people's pride comes into play. Yeah. And people want to do a good job. So when people and nurses are left to do the work that they have trained and have chosen to do, they do it well. And occasionally mistakes are made, and occasionally outcomes may dip, and there could be all sorts of reasons for that. So I think one of the things that Buurtzorg is good at is not knee-jerk reactions. They allow teams a bit of time, and maybe the coach will look at some of the data that comes through that is available to all the teams, but also the team coaches, and might say, oh, it looks like I'm curious about what's going on there. But they will stand back for a while and see what happens. And then they might go to the team and say, hey guys, look, I've looked at your, the system, and this seems to be happening. Have you noticed? And invite a conversation. So they're not going in heavy. They're not going in with that management, you must, or you have to, but an inquiry. It's a kind of an asking mindset. And then the team might say, gosh, no, we haven't realized, we've been super busy and someone's been off sick and we've got maternity leave and all sorts of things and we're struggling. Okay, let's have a conversation. It can go in so many ways, but it's really about first and foremost working with the teams to see, what are you already doing? How is it working? If it's not working, how could I support you? Or how could other teams support you? Perhaps other teams have had similar issues. Let's go and ask. So it's really always working from that bottom up, from that inside out, as opposed to kind of cramming in with, that command and control, judgment mindset, I suppose.
So we're talking about professionalism in I suppose the sense that this is about taking full responsibility, being able to properly scrutinize and peer review, all the things that we're wedded to, I suppose, as professionals. But we know that the Thatcher years really destroyed the notion that professionals could be trusted, that were trustworthy. The sort of, you're leaving people to wait in A&E for hours. You have the problems with babies in ICUs. That actually, where are some of these professionals? The professionals on the golf course scenario. So there was a real distrust about professionalism and professionals and whether they were really in service to need or in service to others versus in service to self.
Yeah.
And so we have this, and I suppose that alongside general management, walking the corridors, who's in charge, this sense that the NHS needs someone to get a grip of it, that people can't be trusted. And yet what we saw, I suppose what was so fantastic, whilst also people have the most horrendous things happening to them in the last few months, one of the most amazing things was that actually professionals showed their worth in that they did step up, they did step in, they did take responsibility, and they would say things like, we felt like the leadership was in service to the work rather than us being in service to some contract, as if the person and the patient didn't matter. Now, those are two very starkly different worlds, Tania, and I understand that our world of performance management is steeped in class, is steeped in the sort of hierarchy, feudal backgrounds of Britain, whatever we might say, our imperialism background. We've got a huge culture to transcend here. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people whose jobs depend on them being in charge.
Yeah.
So my daughter did her undergraduate degree in the Netherlands, and walking into a society where you're challenged for the sake of the task as a right and normal way of operating. I mean, we find it rude. I think I did find it rude to begin with. So that culture of let's try and understand what's going on around here. It's not personal when I challenge you.
Yeah.
Definitely isn't, whereas us Brits find it terribly personal. It's absolutely, diversity and critique is fundamental to innovation. All these things we know to be true. They're culturally a long way away from where we are, Tania. So given that we've had a bit of I suppose we've just had a shadow here. How do we hang on to this shadow and say, do you know what, this is possible in this country too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I smiled when I read your report. I really did, because I was like, yes, there is possibility, there is hope. And isn't it fascinating that, in the biggest crisis that the NHS has seen since, well, probably almost since its inception, that's how people showed up.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like that is there. It's just latent possibility that actually we have trodden all over with our bureaucracies and our hierarchies and our regulations and our fears and our control. And look what happens when that kind of fails, actually, because no amount of control and telling people was going to be able to do what people did in response to COVID-19 and the pandemic. So I think what we need to do now is I think there's a few things. My sense is, at the moment from working with teams, there's a lot of tiredness, actually. I think the crisis, everybody really galvanized in that kind of first stage of the crisis, and have become our NHS and caring heroes, and many other services too, that have kept everything going. But I think it's taken a toll. So I think initially, right now, I think people are tired and need time to recharge and to kind of just to recharge their batteries. And then I think we need to take some time and really allow those teams where this has been the case to just keep going. So I think it would be a big shame if there was a lot of talk, and I know unfortunately there is already talk about going back to normal. I'm really hoping we go forward, and you've talked about going forward better, and I love that. How can we lean into the future with what we have learned from this? So there are teams and services that have absolutely thrived and have demonstrated some of this kind of more self-managing ethos. So how can we have them continue to thrive and be beacons of what is possible? How can we, as managers and leaders in the service, sit back and sit on our hands and allow them to keep going, to work with what's needed, and to show us as leaders and managers in the system actually what's required. Let them come to us saying, this is what we need from you, as opposed to kind of that command and control, this is what we need you to be doing for the wider system. So I think there needs to be a bit of a shift in terms of our attitudes, and we can see it's possible. I think, the Buurtzorg thing about purpose is really important. And whilst many people who've been interested in the Buurtzorg ways of working, sometimes the purpose has been slightly marred by the fact that the defining driver has been around resource and money, as opposed to the defining driver really being about patient need. So let's keep patient need as central to everything else that we do. And then let's be brave, Becky. You know, I think we need to be really questioning every policy, procedure, piece of paper, permission-giving cascade that currently exists for basic things. You know, CCGs and primary care arguing about who's paying the bill for expensive medication, and in the interim a patient doesn't get it. You know, those things have got to be things of the past, where we say we are collaborating because this patient needs this medication and we will do what it takes to make that happen. You know, beds, you know, specialist beds not being provided to people in the community because they have to make 3 different phone calls and forms that have to be faxed. Who has faxes still in 2020? You know, open to the department. So I think we need to be brave. I think we need to take up the kind of the strapline from Buurtzorg, which is humanity over bureaucracy, and have that as a banner really in terms of informing what and how we work. And
that.
Lastly, I think we need to work with our regulatory bodies. So, you know, while Buurtzorg has been making kind of indents into the British systems, if you like, and some NHS trusts and social care local authorities have been working with it. We need to work with CQC as well and change, and I think that was alluded to certainly in Michael West's blog just a couple of weeks ago about what are we learning from COVID-19 as part of the King's Fund. You know, that sense of we're working together here. This is not a regulatory body. This is it could be seen to be a developmental body. Wouldn't it be great if they came in and said, hey, how's it going? We're seeing this and we're seeing that. What are you doing about it? What support do you need? What are you hoping for? What resource do you need? As opposed to a bit more of that punitive pass and fail transaction, that kind of that relationship that exists at the moment. And I think it was happening. So I think there were pockets, but it needs to really be galvanized now.
So I think that just in sort of closing, I think the opportunities are some things you have control over. You have control about how you work as a team within whatever it is you've got going now.
Absolutely.
In general practice or in the outpatient department, how you decide what happens can be done collaboratively and collectively. You can still check in with staff as a whole. So you can start modeling it.
Yep.
I think the second thing is you can start asking and requiring. So I still see a bit of waiting for what's happening next for somebody at the top to decide, rather than we're going to do this. And this is what we need from our CCG. This is what we need from our ICS. This is what we need from our leadership team. This is how we want to do things into the future. And I know people are really tired, but they're also thinking. They've been thinking all the way through.
Absolutely.
Journaling so much, you know. So don't stop thinking and don't stop hoping and don't stop trying. So that's the second thing for me. The third thing is that your problem isn't yours alone to solve. That go find friends.
Yeah.
So if you're on the end of the rethinking the DES for care homes, then who does that impact? It impacts the whole system. It's not something for GPs to solve on their own. They need to do that with their secondary care colleagues, with the care homes themselves. How you respond to the centre with its vast amounts of advice at the moment is partly how you do that systemically, not on your own.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing is be really clear about your purpose and needs and what you need to make decisions. So what's your requirement now in order to, so I've seen some fairly interesting stuff being sent around, we're now going to categorize people by risk rather than by complexity, which is terrible language to use to help people. So how do we use language that's helpful? How do we start with need? There has been a chance for people to start with need to be curious. So come on GPs, come on secondary care folks. You know, what's going on in A&E? Now let's find out what's really going on in A&E. Not just during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic. What is it? Why are people turning up in the way they are? Not just accepting it. So I think go find the data that you need for decisions. Go find the friends you need to collaborate with. Start doing good teamwork because you can. It's up to you to convene it. You're an experienced professional and you can do that. And give up the learning space. And when you look at Nigel Edwards's blog about there's no way we're going back to anything like so-called normal, prior vaccine, because we will just always have to be thinking about how we manage endoscopy suites, everything, then the answer is still going to come back to clinical professionals to start working this out. So whilst it might be wrestled back into a sort of quasi-management model at the moment, it'll have to come back, because the answers still lie with how a clinical profession is going to meet need, and that is unknown actually. So I think there's a real potential.
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I think if we keep the purpose, and the purpose is how can we best provide quality care to our patients and clients and people who need our support, but also how can we work with them. And you talked about it right at the beginning of this session about how can we help them to become more independent and autonomous. So that goes hand in hand. You know, we don't want to create a dependent society. We want to create people who have healthy, independent lives for as long as possible. We've got an aging population, you know, my mother, etc. included. How can we really support all those people going forward for as long as possible in a healthy and sustainable way, and look after our fantastic staff in the process?
Thank you, Tania. For those of you watching for the umpteenth time, I hope you've had a chance to fill in the survey. But whilst our 10 Leaps Forward Innovation in the Pandemic was the result of the first round of the survey, we're in the second round of it. We're enhancing it. We're getting more and more stories. And we're also hoping to bring us all together in a festival of hope, ideas and hope for the NHS at some point over the summer, if I can find some money. So I'm really delighted, Tania, to have that proper conversation with you about this really important issue about how do we work well as teams. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really
Thank you, Becky.